Studying the past begins with archives, those places where artifacts are gathered, stored, and preserved. Archives of manuscripts in particular have stories of their own and often shape the way we understand the past just by the nature of their origins and how they have survived through the ages. Although major collections are now held in museums and preserved by professionals, a century or more ago, it was common for wealthy Western individuals to amass collections of antiquities as prizes of their international exploits. Their acquisitions and archives remain today, but have a thick layer of colonialism that must be considered. There are also non-Western individuals that tried to create collections to keep manuscripts in their place of origin and to preserve local cultural heritage. Two collectors, Claudius Rich, a wealthy early 19th century British orientalist, and Louis Cheikho, a late 19th century Turkish Jesuit priest in Lebanon, had contrasting interests and motivations for amassing their collections of ancient Syriac manuscripts. Our guest today, Maroun El Houkayem, will share the insights of his fascinating work on these two men and the ethical issues their archives raise for how we study antiquity. Hi, I'm your host, Steve Ahearne-Kroll, and this is the Future of the Past Lab, the podcast where we rethink the legacies of injustice in the study of antiquity. Well, welcome, Maroun.
Thank you.
Yeah, so we want to talk about your work that you're doing for your dissertation mostly, but we can stray to whatever sounds interesting to you, and we'll go from there. Your work on the collection process of manuscripts, and especially Syriac manuscripts, and the creation of archives is what you've been centering on. So what drew you to this work?
Thank you for having me first. I started off actually working more on late antiquity and early Christianity, and that was that's still what my track is today. And as I started working more closely with manuscripts and kind of reading more about the history of manuscript collections and how these objects made it to where they are today, and sort of what ethical implications are part of the story, I kind of redirected myself towards working on more the modern period. And it came sort of primarily from me being from Lebanon, and I felt that working only or exclusively on the pre-modern period doesn't really answer what my sort of community is looking for, or like the questions that we're asking, or something that is more relevant to our current world. And I felt like studying more what is happening or what has happened in the last, couple hundred years and how we got to where we are today is more relevant to where I come from.
Yeah.
And I noticed that there's a lot of literature on Greek manuscripts and how those were kind of moved from Egypt or elsewhere because, Greek is closer to the New Testament and all of that. But when it comes to the Syriac manuscripts, there isn't that much there. And Syriac is a bit in an awkward position because that's my interpretation, but because it's a Christian language, but it's, not European, and people, I feel, kind of avoid that question of like, where do we place it? Is it like more of a Middle Eastern studies kind of thing, or is it more of a Christian studies thing?
Yeah.
And I felt like I wanted to address that question and kind of bridge that gap between Eastern Christianity and, Middle Eastern studies. And that's kind of what brought me to looking at how those manuscripts were collected.
Yeah. When I first learned about your work, I know about other collections of things, but in terms of like the ethical dimensions of collections, it's not something that I thought of first. But having heard your talk yesterday, it really seems like it should be thought of first. So can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I was the same, honestly. Before I kind of started my graduate program, I did not think of the ethical implications. And I had worked on manuscripts and translated certain things for my own research. And there was like kind of a questioning of like, well, should this be in the British Library or should it be, somewhere else? But back then I would still tell myself that like, if it's in the British Library, it's well preserved and, that's done. Like it happened in the past and there's nothing we can do about it. And it's not going to change anything now. But later on, when I was like exposed to more readings about colonialism and post-colonial literature, and especially because I worked a little also in Islamic studies, I felt that there's a big difference between what is said in that field and what is said in our fields of, classics, antiquity, etc. There is a very big difference. Like it's a different discourse. And at the end of the day, most of late antiquity, maybe not classics, but takes place in the same geographical place as, Islamic studies or as in the Middle East today or North Africa. But their late antiquity and classics are treated a little bit as if they didn't take place in that part of the world, or kind of that they're not related to anything that's happening there today or to the history of that region in the world. And that kind of what pushed me to kind of think more about these questions and, why that is that these objects in comparison with, things that are related to Islamic studies are treated differently. And I think primarily it's because they're, in this case, a case of classics and antiquity, it's because they're Christian objects or belonging to the Greek antiquity or Roman antiquity, so in Latin or Greek, which of course was like appropriated by, European Western culture. The last few centuries.
You're from Lebanon, so can you describe what's going on? I know it's a crazy time to live in the Middle East by many counts, but just in terms of what you've been studying around manuscript collections and how they're being preserved there or, where they're being preserved in Lebanon now, what are the issues from your perspective that you think are most important?
So what I learned throughout my research is that there's a lot of places to preserve manuscripts or labs to preserve manuscripts, but not to restore manuscripts. And these are two different things. Or I should say conserve, not preserve. But and what that means is that the Bibliothèque Orientale, which I was talking about yesterday, they're a preservation lab, but they're not a restoration lab. So if anything happens to the manuscripts, they don't have the means to fix it and restore it, whether it's in the binding or the papers or etc. And that means that they are wary about giving people access to the manuscript physically, not because they don't want to, but because it risks destroying the manuscript or causing some harm. Not willingly, of course, but, with touching it with your hands, etc. You could probably get access if you want to do, but it's not as easy as in other places.
Right.
And this is something that I didn't know, that there was a difference between, preserving and restoring. And this is where the digital kind of helps. But at the same time, it doesn't, because it only solved one part of the problem, which is you now see what the manuscript is about and see the text, but it's not fixing the long-term problem in that specific case. And the other thing, and sorry, maybe that's not what I said yesterday explicitly, but the story that I told about, the war, the World War I, and how the manuscripts were trying to be preserved. And what I was trying to hint at is that this story has repeated itself multiple times, not just in Lebanon, but in other places where throughout wars, manuscripts were kind of at risk and people were trying to preserve them and move them and hiding them. And we see this still happening today. And I'm not sure if they did that in Lebanon in the recent events that happened, but there's a museum down the street from the library where they had to put down the paintings and kind of make sure that they're not in harm's way. And what I'm trying to go towards is that we should kind of look at these stories and learn something different than the text, something about what that says about us as humans and what we're trying to do and what we're trying to preserve.
Yeah.
And for what purpose.
Yeah. That makes me think about, the main topic of your talk yesterday was to talk about these two people, Claudius Rich and Louis Cheikho, who were two figures that were important in building collections of Syriac manuscripts. And, Rich for the British Museum or the British Library now, and Cheikho was working in Lebanon collecting the manuscripts. So I was wondering if you could talk about their motivations, if you could contrast their motivations and why they were collecting those manuscripts. And I know it wasn't just manuscripts they were collecting, but just focusing on that. Because it seems like Rich being a British citizen and Cheikho not being from Europe and not having a European background, they would have different motivations for doing that.
With Rich, as I was talking about yesterday, he was a very kind of erudite person when it came to languages and Oriental cultures and archaeology. He was one of the first to kind of be interested in the archaeology of Mesopotamia and Assyrian archaeology. And in his letters, he writes about wanting to have a superb collection of manuscripts. So I think it comes from him growing up in that kind of environment where people had manuscripts. And as a kid, he was exposed to some of these manuscripts at the Library of a Gentleman. And someone has argued, Margot Finn, that he was born the legitimate son of an army officer, and he didn't come from wealth because of that situation. And she kind of hints that in some ways maybe that was to compensate for his lack of inherited wealth, and that kind of led him toward collecting material culture. And what I noticed when I was learning more and more about him and I mentioned this a bit briefly yesterday, is that he had a lot of trouble with money in the sense that the East India Company delayed his payments several times, and his salary was not increased in comparison with the person who did this job before him, who was more well connected. So that maybe also was due to him not being from like a high class family. And he was not allowed to trade in goods when he was in Baghdad. So in some way, I don't know if that was his intention or not, but the manuscripts were kind of a safety net. Mm-hmm. And that's what they did at the end when his wife inherited them. They helped her settle a debt against his estate by selling them. So I'm not sure if that was his clear intention, but there is also writings by him and his father-in-law, for example, and his biographer later on, saying that, he was lucky to go to the East at a young age because people were going to the East to make a fortune. His father-in-law tells him, you're lucky you came at a young age because you're going to be able to make a decent amount of money. And whether that was what pushed him to collect manuscripts or not, we can't know for sure.
Yeah.
But there was an economic value to manuscripts at that time and a way to make money from that. When it comes to Cheikho, and this is what kind of made me interested in him, is specifically that he's not from Europe. And he's a very complex figure because he's legally an Ottoman citizen, but he's a Christian and his language is Arabic. His identity is hard to place. It's not easy to kind of just describe what he was doing and be like, this is a European and he was, an orientalist and exoticizing this culture and taking the manuscripts. So it's a very complicated thing. He trained sort of similarly to other orientalists, and I think his desire to collect those manuscripts came from a certain understanding of what education should be and how we should talk about language and solidify the Arabic language at that time period and form kind of a literary culture. So that's what motivated him. And it was a time where Beirut as a city was becoming kind of a modern urban center of learning. And someone mentioned this yesterday, the Arab sort of renaissance of that time period was happening. So there was a big interest in kind of forming a like linguistic identity.
Yeah.
But Cheikho in his writings or the ones that I've read so far, or like in his diaries, he doesn't consider himself an Arab. And that came later anyways, after World War I.
Yeah.
Before that, I think the Arab identity was not as clearly defined. And what he writes also is that he wanted to form an institution that was similar to ones in Europe. And that was what drove him to collect the manuscripts, to kind of make sure that there is a similar institution in that region.
Yeah. Yeah. The interesting thing to me is part of my education is at a Jesuit institution. So
Me too, but
okay.
in high school.
Okay. Yeah. So to think about the Jesuit ethos of education and higher learning is interesting to think alongside what he's doing. But on the other hand, he's also a Jesuit priest that, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but were most of the places where he collected manuscripts religious institutions like monasteries and priories or something along those lines? Or
for the Christian manuscripts, mostly, yes. There were a lot of manuscripts that were given to him, or donated to him by collectors and librarians around the region in Syria and in Lebanon. So some like rich or noble families had a collection of manuscripts. Some of them would donate them to him. He also bought a few of them from normal bookshops that used to sell manuscripts. The Christian ones, a lot of them came from monasteries. The ones in other languages were purchased from bookshops. A lot of them, he got all the way to India. I don't know if I mentioned that yesterday.
No, I didn't realize that.
Yeah. And he bought a lot of manuscripts from there as well. And there were a few who simply donated their libraries to him. So there was a French arms dealer in the region. He moved from Morocco to the Gulf. And I haven't really established how they knew each other or how close they were, but I'm not sure about the number, but he donated his manuscripts at his death to the Oriental Library. So there's different ways in which he got those manuscripts, and some of them were copied when he couldn't get the manuscript itself. And he went to the Jesuits. The Jesuits were even in Syria and different places, and there they kind of helped him obtain more manuscripts as well.
Yeah. So the sense that the manuscripts he was collecting were held in various places, but in religious settings, were they actively used for the life of the monastery, or were they just being stored there as sort of part of the heritage of the monastery?
So we can't really know, I guess, but there's one incident where he tells us that one bishop did not let him see the manuscripts even. It was the Syriac Orthodox bishop in the Mesopotamia region. And he was against him even looking at the manuscripts, not even buying them. And I'm not sure if that means that they were using them or not, or simply storing them. But it's also kind of important to know that by the time he was going on his expedition to get more manuscripts, the Europeans had already been there, and it wasn't a new thing. I think when Rich was collecting the manuscripts, it was still kind of new, or the monks and the priests were still kind of figuring out what to do about that. But by the time Cheikho gets there and he writes about this, it has already become a tradition and a practice. And the priests and the monks are aware of that, which gets him a different reaction than the ones before him. Like Rich goes to a lot of the same places, and he never says that he wasn't allowed to look at the manuscripts. It was more, sometimes he wasn't allowed to take or buy the manuscripts.
Yeah.
It gets a bit different when Cheikho gets there.
Yeah. Yeah, because they're about 100 years apart or so.
Sort of, yeah.
Yeah,
almost.
Yeah. So was Rich part of the original, or one of the first people to go to the Middle East to start collecting manuscripts, or?
No. People went before, but in that region, I think he was kind of one of the first. And I think he was one of the first to kind of do it sort of ethically at the time, because he didn't go as part of like an army and stealing things, or it wasn't kind of a looting situation. It was more so kind of working with the communities, be able to purchase certain manuscripts or copy certain manuscripts.
Yeah. So in terms of, I know you're not looking to evaluate the manuscripts as manuscripts, but you're more interested in the collection and the process of collection and everything. But just as an aside, have you come across any interesting manuscripts that either one of them have collected that you didn't know about, texts that you didn't know about, or things that might revolutionize early Christianity?
I mean, the manuscripts that were repaired that Rich got were kind of surprising, not in terms of the text, but in terms of looking at how the monks or the scribes in previous times tried to repair the text. But with the texts themselves, I'm trying to think now. The ones that I showed, there's one I showed yesterday which had the paintings, which I thought was very interesting.
Yeah.
Even though they're a bit damaged. And it has actually, so the first part is missing. For the rest, it has 3 paintings of each evangelist, Mark, Luke, And I thought that was, because it's a bit rare to find Syriac manuscripts with drawings.
Yeah.
Not completely rare, but I think less so than Greek manuscripts.
Yeah.
But besides that, I can't think of anything right now.
Yeah. So in terms of just tracing the manuscripts from late antiquity and the passing on and the copying of manuscripts in the Middle East as Christianity develops and as Islam develops, and then as the Crusaders try to take back the region or take the region, how are the manuscripts, are the places that they're held sort of thought of as, I can't imagine the Crusaders thinking of them as off limits, but was there kind of a more general idea that there's certain things that are not allowed to be part of the struggle, or as a way of preserving the religious traditions of that area?
At the time of the Crusades?
Or any time like between late antiquity and when Rich starts collecting his manuscripts?
Yeah.
I'm trying to get a picture of how they're preserved over the years between, when they're produced in late antiquity and the continual production of them through or preservation of them.
Yeah. So I don't have the dates exactly now in my head, but there was a big collection of manuscripts that was moved from Mesopotamia and that, like the East, to Egypt. I think it's around the beginning of the millennium, sort of. And that was extremely helpful because and they were moved by a Syriac priest at the time. And because Egypt has a drier climate, that's basically what allowed these manuscripts to survive to this day. People have written about this, Sebastian Brock. So that was, for Syriac studies, that was a big thing. And the Syriac manuscripts that are still exist to this day.
And those are still in Egypt, or did they get relocated?
A lot of them are in the British Library. And I'm not sure. There's still a few.
It's like the filter, everything goes there eventually.
Yeah. And a lot of them are in the Vatican Library. And that's kind of what started this move towards Egypt. The Vatican, and second half of the 18th century, started collecting more and more manuscripts from that region. And that kind of had a big popularity. Like, it was heard all across Europe and sparked kind of envy to go to Egypt and collect more manuscripts in the rest of the 19th century.
Yeah. So this kind of brings up for me the question of the role of colonialist activity in the collection of these manuscripts. And it's what you're describing, it seems that although a lot of manuscripts were preserved in the Middle East and in Egypt, there was a sort of extended concerted effort to take them from there and put them in Western European contexts. Can you talk about that process a little bit and what the ethical implications are for it now, in terms of how we think about those collections, British Museum and in the Vatican Library?
Yeah. There's one thing I wanted to say yesterday also that I forgot, but gradually we can see how it changed. It wasn't the same. Like I was talking about Cheikho and Claudius Rich, but also in Egypt, after kind of the mid-19th century, the monks started becoming a bit more aware about what was happening and kind of against moving the manuscripts. And we can see like towards the end of the 19th century, less and less manuscripts were leaving monasteries and scholars had to either copy them or photograph them. And what I wanted to say yesterday, because I was asked, and I forgot to mention this, is that a lot of people focus on manuscripts that were stolen. And I think that gets a bit more attention because it's more, dramatic sort of. But what I'm trying to get at is that it's not simply about, stealing and, right or wrong in the traditional sense, but the kind of effort to go to these places and assuming that you're going to be able to buy manuscripts and enter certain private spaces, because I think people forget where they did at the time that monasteries are homes and private spaces. But you can see that these Europeans were traveling very far. At the time, obviously, it was very hard and costly to do that with the belief that they can access these places and they're entitled sort of to get to these places and come back with manuscripts and buy them.
Right.
And that is due, obviously, to them being Christian, the manuscripts, I mean, and of course, the religious ideas at the time and ideas of universality, which again, another thing that I wanted to say is that going back to monasteries being private places, I think a hard pill to swallow for some people, but I think that manuscripts are written sort of notes, and not notes, but as in, it's similar to me copying the Bible right now and putting it in my room and someone coming to my room and telling me this is mine.
Right.
So it's sort of, this is what is happening, to put it very simply.
So it's less a publication process and more of a personal transmission of these texts.
Yeah, and I mean, for the local communities, it's not something that needs to be universal. It's not something that is a big thing that was focused on in Europe. And I think people tend to forget that because it's the Bible, or any classical other text.
Nobody owns that text, and so therefore the manuscripts should be everybody's.
Yeah, but at the end of the day, maybe that's like a simple way to put it, but it is a copy that was made and kept in that place. And it's very similar to anything that we would copy today and put it in our offices or in our rooms.
Yeah, and as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking of the parallel with other sort of ancient artifacts and how the practices of collection and preservation have changed dramatically in the last 50 years with the laws around, if something is found in an archaeological dig in a place, it has to stay in that place, that it's illegal to take it and trade it in the open market. And has that been the case for manuscripts as well now, that there's been regulations set up around those?
I think so, but there's still a lot of manuscripts on the art dealing market, and that's the same for antiquities. And what I was trying to talk about a little bit yesterday also in my conclusion is that what doesn't end is the way we're still trying to get at the manuscripts. So initially it was collecting them physically, and later that stopped for several reasons. Either the monks stopped agreeing, or other communities stopped selling them, or rules and regulations started appearing. But what happened, we worked around that, and different things were created, either microfilms, in the past, and then we moved into digitization.
Yeah.
So for me, these things are different ways to avoid dealing with the issue and to kind of maintain a certain kind of power dynamic. And it's not really addressing the main issue or the main question, which is why are we still trying to get at these manuscripts or objects? And everything is good and bad, or has a good side and bad side. And people sometimes assume that I'm against digitization and that I hate it, but that's not the case. But it's simply that it's very common when something is new and modern and exciting to not really pause and think about it and think about what are the implications of it. And who is really benefiting from it and who is not.
Yeah.
And I think that happens with the digitization of the manuscripts. But I don't think that I know of. There's still some manuscripts that get moved, but I don't think it's very common.
Mm-hmm.
It's very similar to artifacts.
Yeah. What would you propose would be a good first step or next step to accounting for the place of where the manuscripts are produced and preserved? So, for instance, if there's a 10th century Syriac manuscript that we know was produced in a particular place, let's say Lebanon, or let's say Damascus or something, even if it's not there anymore, should we, when we interpret that manuscript in whatever way, the content of it, the production of it, the notes on the side, perhaps the scribal activity or whatever, how much do we have to account for the fact that it comes from Damascus and the culture and history in the 10th century Damascus?
Yeah, it's complicated.
Yeah, yeah.
It depends on what you're looking for, I think, or what you're studying it for. I think it's important to mention, but it's also what I'm learning more and more is that, again, depending on the project, but if it is in the British Library today, that's also important because it's not, the manuscript didn't die when it went to the British Library, or
Right.
the world around it didn't end.
Right.
And it's still active in today's world. But there's an understanding, or like the common practice is that once it entered the collection and became an academic object, then that's when, it sort of died and it's only now an object of study.
Right.
But the academic community is a culture in itself, and it's still using that manuscript differently or different than how it was. So I think it should be mentioned. The provenance is very important. And of course, the manuscript came from that community, but the different stages it went through to get to the British Library, or maybe it was only one, and its life today is as important, I would say. And it gives us a better understanding of what we are doing now. Mm-hmm. And like going back to what I was saying about Lebanon, I think this is what I was trying to get at, is that just because these manuscripts were from different places and now they're at this library, it doesn't mean that they're detached from the community that is this library today.
Yeah.
And the country that Lebanon is today, and the city.
Yeah. And it tells a story, a bit of the story of Lebanon at different points in time. And not to erase that is an important thing, because you're basically erasing not just history kind of as an academic, exercise, but you're erasing the people from that region.
Exactly. And the modern people living there now.
Yeah. That always raises a question about, once we learn about the past and sometimes the dark history of how we come across something or how we inherit our knowledge, what do we do with that? There's been a few things written recently about the fact that it's highly likely that enslaved people were used to write, if not the original versions of the New Testament, then the manuscripts that were produced very early and all the way through late antiquity. So what do we do with that information? How do we handle that dark side of Christianity? How do we come to grips with that? So, any wisdom there?
Yeah. I mean, the first thing I feel like I want to say is that we can't hide from it. We can't, bad things have happened and they still do.
Yeah.
And I think it hits closer to home to people when it's their work or when it's their culture. And I mean here the academic culture, not necessarily the Christian one. And you notice that whenever we talk about previous academics, people tend to react a certain way. That has happened to me. People assume that I have certain feelings about these people that I'm talking about, and that I'm drawing them as terrible people.
Yeah.
But that doesn't happen when you're talking about someone in antiquity.
Right, right.
And there is a sense of who people choose as their ancestors and who they not, and who they kind of allow themselves to be critical about and who they don't. And I think with those histories, the bad episodes of history, I don't think there's any other way than to be truthful about them and just learn about them and address them and kind of create a dialogue of what do we do about these things, or how do we move on or move forward knowing these things? What are other ways that we can produce knowledge from manuscripts knowing what we know?
Yeah.
Like the example you mentioned, that would serve us today or answer questions that we're facing.
Yeah, yeah. And, I don't know if you've come across this, but, religion tends to have a bit of self-righteousness to it sometimes, and religious people tend to have that. And so Yeah, I think it's really important to have a realistic picture of how we got where we are so that we realize that this is not a pure process, that it comes with baggage that we have to be aware of and try not to repeat those same mistakes from the past.
Yeah. And I think it tells more about us if we learn some horrible thing in history and decide not to say it than the people that actually did them,
Yeah.
If you learn something and decide not to talk about it, in a way you're complicit in
Right.
that.
And almost propagating more, the same thing over and over.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I understand that people sometimes have sensitivities around certain things, but the only way forward is like through.
Right.
Yes.
Right. The last thing we always like to ask our guests are about underrepresented people in the field who are doing really interesting work that maybe some people don't know about, or you would like to lift up in particular, and people that you've come across in your work that you think are really doing important, interesting work that are maybe not getting the credit.
Yeah, of course, there's more than one can mention, I think.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people doing great work. But one that I thought about, or there's a few, but one that I thought about was as an Egyptologist. Her name is Hiba Abdel-Gawad. And she was part of a project that I really like, that basically they did this like digital humanities thing, like a website where they put almost all the information that is related to moving Egyptian artifacts from Egypt. So they included sort of all the sponsors that were funding these expeditions. They include a map that shows where most Egyptian, I don't know if they did all of them, but where a lot of Egyptian artifacts ended up, with links and everything. So I think that was a great project because it's not simply about the Egyptian artifact in its history or in the time where it was used, but it's very helpful to show how spread out that movement was of these artifacts and how much money was put into it. And to see the map of like where they are today, I think tells the message that this is equally as important as pre-modern times. And I think it's a very helpful thing to look at and to kind of entice people to consider these things a bit more. And I hope to emulate this with manuscripts and to try to do this. I think it's a very important visual aid for these things. Other people, again, Egyptian, is Osama Ali Gad, who is a papyrologist. He works a lot on trying to decolonize papyrology, and he's very honest about the problems that people from the global south face in terms of getting access to certain things and how papyrology has been built as a field of study and its implications with, again, ethical questions and stuff like that.
He was part of our original moment of the Future of the Past before it became the Future of the Past Lab. He was one of our guests.
All right. Yeah. His work really helped me think about certain things, about like positionality and being able to talk about sources that, like from that region, being in a kind of Western academic environment. And there's another project that I really appreciated. It's a big project. It's called the Ahearne Network. It's in the UK. And it's kind of collaborative work between British universities and universities in Iraq. And Ahearne means two rivers in Arabic, meaning the Tigris and the Euphrates. And they're doing several projects under that umbrella, which tries to kind of look at questions of cultural heritage and collaboration between the two communities and the two countries, and kind of find ways to these questions and to these problems of cultural heritage and access and the movement of artifacts to the UK. And one thing that I appreciate about them is that they try to translate everything into Arabic, the local language. And I think that's
great. No, that all sounds wonderful. Well, thank you for your time, and thank you for sharing your insights about this really fascinating process that we sort of take for granted. And when we start digging into it, it becomes more and more complex and important to think about. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
This has been a production of the Future of the Past Lab at the University of Minnesota's Department of Classical and Near Eastern Religions and Cultures. Our recording engineer is Jonathan Prestrud at the College of Liberal Arts Language Center at the University of Minnesota. Visit futureofthepastlab.com to learn more about how we are rethinking the legacies of injustice in the study of antiquity.